Hi class, today we're going to cover chapter 16, the Return of Assyria from the Story of the World. In this video, we're going to be reviewing chapter 16, talking about the Old Kingdom of Assyria, the Middle Kingdom of Assyria, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And we're going to start with your chapter 16 review. So the Assyrian Empire was built by Shamshi-Adad and conquered by Hammurabi. These are things we've studied several times before. The Assyrians regain their independence from Babylon. They take over cities in Mesopotamia, and they even take the Israelites captive. One of the more notable kings is Ashurbanipal. He conquers Egypt. The Assyrians are just impossible to be under him, and one of the reasons why is because of his fighting methods. The Assyrians fought in pairs. One man had a shield, the other one would shoot arrows from behind that shield, and something else they used was siege towers. They fired arrows from top of the tower, and they had battering rams to break down the walls of cities. In your chapter, Susan Wise Bauer said, Ashurbanipal was cruel and ruthless to the cities he conquered. He burned houses, smashed walls, and killed anyone who tried to disobey him. He scattered salt in their fields, poisoning the land so that no crops would grow. Like, that's just terrible. He took captured people off to be slaves and never let them go home again. So Ashurbanipal was a terrible person, and he ruled the biggest empire in the world at that time. So I'm sure you can imagine that people really hated him. But one of the more notable things that he did was he built a library. He really wanted to be remembered. And so he begins this library project. He sends scribes to collect tablets. Other scribes are sent to interview people, and they wrote down those stories. He had priests write down prayers. Astrologers wrote down movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Doctors wrote down what they knew about illness and medicine. Historians wrote down what they knew about kings from the past. And so the Library of Nineveh was built. It housed thousands of clay tablets, and it is considered the first library in the world. Unfortunately, much of it was destroyed during Assyria's wars, but thankfully, some still survive today. So we have a lot of catching up to do, like a lot of catching up. And that's because we left off with Shamshi-Adad in 1813, Hammurabi 1792 to 1750. But then where we are with Ashurbanipal is 668 to 626 BC, which means we just skipped over 1,000 years of history. So Assyrian history is typically divided into 3 time periods by historians: the Old Kingdom of Assyria, the Middle Kingdom of Assyria, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So what we're going to be doing in this video is taking a look at each of these time periods, just briefly covering the high points. It's going to be very general because there's just no way to cover this much history well if we go into too much detail. Okay, so we're going to start with the Old Kingdom of Assyria, 1900 to 1363 BC. So we're going to start with the City of Assur. The City of Assur was founded around 1900 BC based on the dating of the ruins, although people probably lived in this area prior to this. The City of Assur had been under the rule of the Akkadian Empire, the Sumerians during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, or the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And after the collapse of the Sumerian Empire in 2004, it does regain its independence for a while. So here are 3 maps I want to show you. Here's the Akkadian Empire up here, and Assur is right here. So we can see it's under the Akkadian Empire. Then we have the 3rd dynasty of Ur, and I think it's right here. And then we have Assyria, who regains that independence. So Shamshi-Adad and Hammurabi, we've studied these 2 before. Shamshi-Adad takes over Assur and begins the Assyrian Empire from 1813 to 1791 BC. He makes Assur his capital, and then he unites several Assyrian cities. This is the first time Assyria becomes an empire. A year after Shamshi-Adad dies, Hammurabi then conquers Assyria. Assyria becomes a vassal of the Babylonian Empire. So you can see here in the first map, the kingdom of Shamshi-Adad in pink, and then Babylon in the south, and then how Babylon takes over that whole region, and you have Assur, which is right here. And here's Nineveh, by the way. Nineveh becomes the capital eventually. So I'm just going to give you a quick side note on Babylon. We covered this a little bit in our previous video, but the Babylons would rule that region for a while, but they would grow weaker and weaker and lose territory. The Babylons were conquered by the Hittites in 1595. Remember, the Hittites were the ones who battled Ramses II during the Battle of Kadesh. However, the Hittites were too far away to control the region. So the Kassites, who were wandering nomads, come in and they take over Babylon for the next 400 years. Here's some maps that you can see. Here's the Hittite kingdom right here and how they go and they invade Babylon. And then afterwards, the Kassites come in, and this is called Kassite Babylonia. Okay, so let's get back to Assyria. So as the Babylonians lose their power, the Assyrians would gain independence, as you can see in the blue right here. But you can see that they're really tiny. They're not able to grow into an empire like before. And a powerful kingdom to the west named the Mitanni annexed Assyria around 1472 BC. Here you can see the Mitanni in yellow, and you have Kassite Babylon down in this region, and here is Assur, and here is the Hittite kingdom. So you guys remember the Hittites, right? How they battled the Egyptians in the Battle of Kadesh. They're the ones that destroyed Hammurabi's Babylon. They don't like the Mitanni, and the Mitanni don't like them either. So there has been a lot of fighting between these two empires. But we get to a point where the Hittites decide we're going to go to battle against the Mitanni. Now, this is the part I find interesting, is that, remember, Assyria or Assur is in the Mitanni Empire, and Egypt was secretly smuggling weapons to Assyria in order to beat the Mitanni, who were in control of them. So Egypt is just like, hey, here's these weapons, beat the Mitanni. So when the Hittites decide they're going to go to war, the Hittites and the Assyrians team up and they destroy the Mitanni, like completely, so much that the Mitanni would never be a nation again, and Assyria is able to regain its independence. This brings us to the Middle Kingdom of Assyria, 1363 to 934 BC. So during the Middle Kingdom, we have many strong kings. Several of them began rebuilding and expanding the Assyrian Empire. One king comes and conquers the remaining Mitanni that are there, and they take all of Mitanni's territory. Another powerful king is able to defeat the Hittites, and their defeat of the Hittites began the end of the Hittite civilization. So I want you to see this shift happening, where Assyria was this region which was conquered by and taken over by the Assyrians, the Sumerians, the Mitanni, the Babylonians, and now they are growing to the point where they are able to take all the Mitanni land and even defeat the Hittites, which was a very strong empire. So as you can see here, here's Assyria in blue, and the Hittite Empire, which was very big at this point, in purple. But this is when Hittites begin to decrease. So during the Middle Kingdom, the Assyrians, again, are growing, and they begin deporting people that they conquer. That means that they take people from their land. Like, hey, we just conquered you. We're going to take you from your land, and they're going to put them in another part of the empire. So your homework is to figure out, why do you think the Assyrians did this? They had very specific and strategic reasons for deportation. So I want you to do some research and figure this out. Then, as Assyria was growing and becoming stronger under these powerful kings, something called the Dark Ages of Mesopotamia, or the Bronze Age collapse, happens. It's a very fascinating time in ancient history, but for about 100 years, from 1250 to 1150, the ancient world entered a period of decline. Joshua J. Marks says, major cities were destroyed, whole civilizations fell, diplomatic and trade relations were severed, writing systems vanished, and there was widespread devastation and death on a scale never experienced before. Now this, during the Bronze Age collapse, is when the Hittite Empire fell, and they were never able to rise and become an empire again. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, this is a really weird time in history. Like, what? Civilizations fell, writing systems vanished, death on a scale never seen before. Why in the world did this happen? And unfortunately, scholars are really divided on this and can't really make up their minds. But possible reasons for the collapse is drought and famine caused by climate change, natural disasters, disease. There was invasions from different people groups that happened during this time, particularly by the Aramaeans and the Sea people. The Sea people also invade Egypt, but also political instability caused by a lot of internal rebellions happening. Now, all of this stuff has happened in these ancient civilizations many times, but a lot of them survived. So that's why scholars are like, and historians can't quite figure out why, but one of the theories is that maybe all of this happened at once. It wasn't just like, oh, we have drought, or oh, we have invasion. It was like everything happened all at once, and all of these civilizations just kind of declined or even collapsed. So during the Bronze Age collapse, only Egypt and Assyria remain as powers, but both are pretty static. They lose territory, they can't expand, and they are weakened in power. So here's the Assyrian Empire during this time. So towards the end of the collapse, a king named Tiglath-Pileser I takes the throne. Don't you just love ancient names? He's a very energetic king. He revitalizes the economy. He conquers many surrounding regions. He kind of takes advantage of the state of the region at this time in conquering the regions. Under him, culture, art, and trade flourish. He even establishes several zoos, which I find very fascinating. In the Ancient History Encyclopedia, it says he was one of the most important Assyrian kings of this period, meaning like the Middle Kingdom, largely because of his wide-ranging military campaigns, his enthusiasm for building projects, and his interest in cuneiform tablet collections. He campaigned widely in Anatolia, where he subjugated numerous peoples and ventured as far as the Mediterranean Sea. In the capital city, Assur, he built a new palace and established a library, which held numerous tablets on all kinds of scholarly subjects. Now, this wasn't as big as Ashurbanipal's library, but he tried to make something like that. He also issued a legal decree, the so-called Middle Assyrian laws, and wrote the first royal annals. He is also one of the first Assyrian kings to commission parks and gardens stocked with foreign and native trees and plants. So I want you to understand where the Assyrians are at this time. So we went from the Assyrians being conquered and ruled by all of these different nations to rising up to the point where when the whole area kind of collapses into a dark age, Assyria is still able to maintain a certain semblance of power, and towards the end really rise up to the point where they're not just thriving, they're able to do things like make gardens and zoos. So here's the Assyrian Empire, which brings us into the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 934 to 609 BC. So I'm going to give you just a quick overview of this time period. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is characterized by powerful kings who expanded Assyria to its greatest extent. Many kings of this time are mentioned in the Bible. The kings of this time are known for being really cruel and ruthless, like Ashurbanipal. It is the most powerful military force at this time, stronger than Egypt. The culture, the Assyrian culture, becomes more unified. Remember, they're conquering a lot of different people groups. So during this time, it's becoming more unified. They moved the capital to Nineveh, and they are responsible for the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. So here's some ruins from Nineveh. And here's a map. You can see how much Egypt has declined and how Assyria has taken over. There's no Mitanni, no Hittites, no Babylon, and they control this whole region. And Israel was right here, and they take over that. They used very interesting and excellent military tactics. So here's another quote from the Ancient History Encyclopedia. More than anything else, the Assyrian army excelled in siege warfare and was probably the first force to carry a separate corps of engineers. Assault was their principal tactic against the heavily fortified cities of the Near East. They developed a great variety of methods for breaching enemy walls. Sappers were employed to undermine walls or to light fires underneath wooden gates, and ramps were thrown up to allow men to go over the ramparts or to attempt a breach on the upper section of wall where it was the least thick. Mobile ladders allowed attackers to cross moats and quickly assault any point in defenses. These operations were covered by masses of archers who were the core of the infantry. But the pride of the Assyrian siege trains were their engines. These were multi-storied wooden towers with 4 wheels and a turret on top and 1 or at times 2 battering rams at the base. So you can kind of just visualize this, and other nations and cities just didn't have this type of advance in their military. So you can understand why the Assyrians were impossible to beat. They were impossible to stop. So I want to make a mention on Assyrian cruelty. So along with their advanced military tactics, again, the Assyrians are known for being really, really cruel. So I'm going to read this quote to you. If you are squeamish, skip this slide. You don't want to hear this. I put up a pillar at the city gate, Ashurbanipal explains, recording his dealings with a city which had revolted and killed its Assyrian appointed governor, and skinned the chiefs who revolted against me, and covered the pillar with their skins. I walled up others in the middle of the pillar itself, and some of them I impaled on stakes and arranged them around the pillar. Inside the city I skinned many more and covered the walls with their skins. He varied this at other times by making heaps of cut off noses and ears, gouging out eyes, and tying heads to vines through the garden of conquered cities. So that is obviously very disturbing, very disgusting, but I wanted to just give you one example of why the Assyrians were known for their cruelty and people were so scared of them, and also why people hated them so much. So some notable kings are Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib. We're not going to talk about them right now. We will talk about them when I do a separate video on Israel, because these kings will be significant within Israel's history. But I just wanted to make a mention that there are very strong kings of Assyria. We will talk about them later. Which brings us to Ashurbanipal. So he's the last great king of Assyria. He ruled the empire that stretched 1,000 miles from the Nile River to the Caucasus Mountains. He even campaigned in Egypt, like you read about in your chapter. He's just so interesting because he's like really violent, but also he's very intellectual. He made the first systematic list of plants and animals. He brought scribes on campaigns to record new findings. He established schools throughout the empire, and he ruled for 42 years. Ashurbanipal's library. This is a quote from Ashurbanipal. He says, I, Ashurbanipal, within the palace understood the wisdom of Nabu, the god of learning, all the art of writing of every kind. I made myself the master of them all. I read the cunning tablets of Sumer in the dark Akkadian language, which is difficult to rightly use. I took my pleasure in reading stones inscribed before the flood. The best of the scribal art, such works as none of the kings who went before me had ever learned, remedies from the top of the heads to the toenails, non-canonical selections, clever teachings, whatever pertains to the medical mastery of the gods Ninurta and Gela. I wrote on tablets, checked and collated and deposited within my palace for perusing and reading. So this is his perception of himself. We don't know if he really was this well-versed or could speak all these languages or not, but this is just to kind of give you a flavor of what type of person he was. So the library has thousands of texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh. H.G. Wells says it's the most precious source of historical material in the world. The remains of the library was discovered in the 1850s, and the tablets are in the British Museum. So guys, if you ever go to the UK, go to the British Museum and check this out. And here they are, the tablets in the British Museum. So the fall of Assyria. So the empire ends up growing too large. Everyone is very overtaxed, and an economy can't thrive when people are overtaxed. It's so large that the borders of the empire are very difficult to defend, and the Assyrian Empire begins to fall and decline when Ashurbanipal dies in 627. Remember, because he is the last great king. In 612 BC, Assyria was destroyed by a coalition of nations, which included Babylon. So that's like all of Assyrian history in 20 minutes. Hopefully you kind of understand the ebb and flow and certain characteristics of Assyria. Again, we will be talking more about Assyria when we study Israel. So that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.